I'd like to welcome Dr Sophie Papa, who is the clinical lecturer in immuno-oncology at KCL and honorary consultant in medical oncology at the Trust. So Sophie's going to be joining us on stage to give the next presentation. Sophie's worked several groundbreaking clinical trials using advanced therapies in oncology, and she's here to tell us more about that and the opportunities that advanced therapies can offer. So Sophie, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can we have the next slide? So as Kate has, actually, if we go on to the next slide, that'll be brilliant. As Kate has said, I'm here to talk. In fact, the brief I was given was to talk about clinical implementation of advanced therapies, which is a really complex and interesting topic to be given to speak about. And I thought I would address it by talking through some of the challenges and some of the opportunities and some of the trials and some of the ATIMPs that we've used at GSTT that have enabled us to think through the challenges and the roadblocks and the opportunities that are ahead of us as we bring these therapies more and more into mainstream clinical use once they are the subject of regulatory approval. So I've got a few little blocks here which I'm going to talk you through. The first, which I'm going to come back a little bit later in my presentation to, is a drug called tamilogene lahapaparavec, which we all call TVEC, you'll be happy to know, which was the first advanced therapy to be licensed for the treatment of cancer in Europe and the US. TVEC is a genetically modified herpes simplex virus that we use to treat melanoma. And we were actively involved in some clinical trials with the drug before it received its license. And as a result, we're in a very good position to set up a clinical service as soon as it was NICE approved in 2016. And we were the first centre in the UK to start giving TVEC routinely, and we remain the centre that gives the most of this drug. And I'm going to come back to that later. The second clinical programme I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute is the T4 immunotherapy programme, led by Dr. John Meyer, who's a clinical academic here at KCL also. T4 is a CAR T-cell study, and it was very much the subject alongside the T-regulatory development that happened in midway through last decade in the process of setting up the GMP facility here in the Biomedical Research Centre. Our manufacturing runs were critical to the license acquisition that we required from the MHRA for the GMP facility, and we've continued to run that study through the facility, and that is ongoing. Other things that we've needed to sort of clinically implement advanced therapies within the Trust include really boring but important committees such as the Biological Safety Committee. If you want to run a clinical trial with a genetically modified organism, you need to have been through fundamental health and safety and regulatory requirements to ensure that you're compliant with national legislation around using GMOs. We set up the Biological Safety Committee. It had existed before, but it sort of fizzled out. We reset it up within the BRC in January of 2018, and it's been fundamental in helping us open trials across all kinds of indications across Guy's and St Thomas's over the last 3 or 4 years. And then there's a really fundamental infrastructure such as leukapheresis. Our heme team here at Guy's have been continuing to do apheresis, particularly for red cell apheresis, but we transferred our bone marrow transplant service down to King's College Hospital to that site. It's a consolidation exercise some years ago. And so we've had to go through a process over the last couple of years of thinking about how we can build up and again expand and repurpose our apheresis service to enable us to leukapherese for advanced therapies. These are things that are often thought about late and overlooked when you're thinking about operational capability in an organisation. And I can't emphasise enough that infrastructure such as leukapheresis, apheresis are going to be fundamental, not just to hemato-oncology, but to many different tenets of advanced therapies that we're developing at GSTT and beyond our boundaries going forward. There is a national shortage of leukapheresis capability, which is an impediment to clinical development of advanced therapies at the moment, not just in the UK. As well as being a clinical academic, I have a wet lab doing CAR T-cell research, and I'm a melanoma oncologist at Guy's and St Thomas's. I'm also one of the 4 phase 1 PIs here at Guy's, and I lead our cell therapy programme. I'm not the only PI doing cell therapy trials within oncology, but I'm responsible for all of the infrastructure and for developing the team. And we have a growing portfolio of industry-led sponsored trials, as well as our academic portfolio. We currently have 3 tumour-infiltrating lymphocyte protocols open. I have 2 patients on treatment for TIL at the moment. We have a TCR a study sponsored by Adaptimmune that we are actively recruiting to, and we have multiple trials and set up. In fact, we're having to be very selective about what we accept at the moment, because harking back to that kind of operational challenge and that skills challenge, there is a need for sites and there is a need for PIs to be able to be in a position to deliver these kind of advanced therapy trials in oncology. And actually that is a bottleneck somewhat internationally at the moment. And then there's the, I could talk all day about the last box, which is operational forward view. Up until, really for oncology, up until trying to deliver these complex cell-based therapies where there is great risk of toxicity to patients, we didn't really step into the clinical landscape within Guy's and St Thomas's. But now, because our patients need long inpatient stays and a lot of support from allied professionals, we're doing that, and that raises a number of challenges. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk through before I get there, this slide is just to illustrate, sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, my elephant and mouse. We stand on the shoulders of giants because our hematology colleagues are already delivering CAR T-cell therapy for the treatment of CD19 and BCMA-expressing malignancies. And that has opened the doors and made life easier for operational development. But the hematology indications are currently still small. It's a small number of patients who will be receiving these therapies. And if advanced therapies receive regulatory approval in oncology, we're looking at a potential tsunami of indication. And then there is, of course, all of the work that we are involved in here at GSTT in non-malignant cellular therapies that we're going to need to have the capacity to handle. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through the T4 study briefly. T4 is a CAR T-cell study led by John Meyer, where we treat head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, which is a nasty disease that can and often does kill people through local regional progression. Next slide, please. We designed a very straightforward first-in-human study with a 3+3 dose escalation with a planned 5 cohorts initially, and now we're in cohort 6. It was the subject of an amendment. Because of risks about toxicity from this particular construct, our first 5 cohorts did not have lymphodepleting chemotherapy. Next slide, please. And we successfully progressed through all of the dose levels. I'm not expecting you to read this slide, but what you can see here is that we recruited robustly to all of the first 5 cohorts, including patients in their 80s and patients with performance status of greater than 1, which was allowed in the protocol up until its recent amendment. Next slide, please. We've successfully manufactured now 17 products, or we're in our 17th product of T4. Our 17th patient, the second patient in cohort 6, is on the clinical research facility right now, receiving his last day of lymphodepleting chemotherapy, and the trial is progressing. We have looked at the first 5 cohorts before lymphodepletion and shown that we can safely deliver these CAR T-cell therapies to patients with this complex and comorbid disease, and that we have tantalizing early signals of response that are not long-lived. And the next step is to start to lymphodeplete and to add in additional therapies to support T4. This program's been running for 6 years and has been very much a collaborative effort within the BRC. Next slide. And cohort 6, we move on, that as I just mentioned, we're recruiting to now, which is a slightly more complex and higher risk step in this trial. Next slide, please. So I want to talk briefly about TVEC. Can you just click through until we've got all the, so next slide, then next slide, then next slide, then next slide. So TVEC is a genetically modified virus. It's herpes simplex. It's had 2 genes removed and a couple of genes put in place that make it into an effective oncolytic therapy. Next slide. This is a case of an 89-year-old lady with melanoma. She'd had melanoma on her cheek, multiple surgeries. It kept coming back. She went on to have pembrolizumab, which is the groundbreaking immune therapy that we use to treat cancer now and is often curative for melanoma, but it did not work for her, and she was referred to me a couple of years ago. Next slide. This is what her disease looked like. It was awful. It was bleeding. She wasn't going out. She was very distressed by it, and ultimately it was going to be rapidly life-limiting. Next slide. This is what her face looked like after 7 doses of TVEC, which is given every 2 weeks. This was in 2018 at the beginning, and she remains in remission now, and she had no side effects really apart from a bit of discomfort from treatment. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide where I'm going to talk, the reason for showing you that TVEC case was to illustrate that these drugs work really well and that they should be being used, and TVEC is not being used as widely as it should be. There are only a number of sites in the UK that deliver it. And that's because the complexity of delivering a GMO puts people off, and the challenges associated with it are not insignificant. And so there is a lot of work to do to help us operationalize these therapies. But there's opportunity, patient access to really exciting new treatments that can potentially lengthen life. We also do a lot of reverse translation here. I have funding from GSK and also from a company called Instill Bio, where we're accessing patient tissue to enable development of knowledge around advanced therapies. And that's a really interesting avenue for research. And then there's the whole world of skills development for our colleagues at Guy's and St Thomas's. But we face huge challenges. We need space for pharmacy, stem cell labs, apheresis, and inpatient care. And we need to do the opportunity of skills development is also a challenge within this space. Next slide. That's all I've got time for. I could talk about this all day. Thank you very much for inviting me and listening to me.